Hello and welcome to Signs from Heaven. I'm David, and today we want to go over the final sign of Revelation chapter 12. Remember, we had done a previous video called Revelation 12 Ends in 2022, and we had stopped at the last sign. And it was kind of like cliffhanger. And the reason that I wanted to do that is because we'd seen for 5 years Jupiter had fulfilled every prophecy, mirroring in heavens was on earth, spot on for 5 years. And the last one, it says, why not let everybody else anticipate and see Bible prophecy come to pass right before their eyes? And so that's why I did that. And it's kind of taking a chance because you're saying this is going to happen, and it has to happen. But it was so it was so obvious that the Apostle John was following Jupiter. Yeah, we knew it had to happen. Well, I'm glad to tell you something did happen, but it's not what we thought. And so it was kind of like in your face, right in front of you, and you miss it. And I missed it. And after a month, finally the Holy Spirit just shook me, and it's like, oh, wow, that's what it was. And it's not exactly what we thought, but it fits perfectly. And if you haven't seen the previous video, watch it first, then you can anticipate what everybody else has been seeing and see if you would have figured it out. Because you can always see this video and say, oh yeah, I'd have known that. But watch the first one and then wait one day and then come back and watch this video. And anyway, I think you'll enjoy it, and we'll see you later. In the video, Revelation chapter 12 ends in 2022. We closely follow Jupiter's path over the last 5 years from 2017 until 2022. And we saw that every prophecy from chapter 12 happened on the earth down to the finest detail. With impeccable precision, Jupiter had mirrored the events from earth in the heavens. Notice on this ancient image of the constellation Aquarius how on February the 21st of 2022, Jupiter has just barely entered the stream of water being poured out of Aquarius's cistern. Jupiter has just made a conjunction with the first star in the stream, so this is when to expect things to start happening. Now let's take a look at the prophecy by the Apostle John describing the final sign of Revelation chapter 12. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, Israel, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, Israel, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Well, it just turns out that something very significant happened on February the 21st. Russian President Vladimir Putin made an astounding declaration. He said that Russia would recognize two self-declared independent republics from neighboring Ukraine. On Monday, the 21st of February, in a ceremony carried on state television, Putin signed decrees recognizing the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic as independent countries. Earlier in the day, the heads of these two self-proclaimed pro-Russian republics had requested that Russia formally recognize their independence and sovereignty. Not only did the Russian parliament recognize the two republics, but they immediately ratified treaties of friendship and mutual assistance on the same day, the 21st of February, the day that Jupiter entered the stream of water, the day that we were looking at. A treaty of friendship and mutual assistance is a defense pact. It's a pledge to give military and financial aid. Normally, this would have taken weeks or months to iron all the details, but here Putin did it instantly on February the 21st. The reason for this is that the situation was dire. The two republics faced an imminent genocide as the Ukrainian forces were already planning to invade 3 days later. The Donetsk Republic and the Luhansk Republic had separated back in 2014 after a U.S.-led coup successfully overthrew the legitimate Ukrainian president. They had held out on their own for 7 years, but without Russia's assistance, it would have all ended. Here's the essential part of President Vladimir Putin's speech.
В этой связи считаю необходимым принять уже давно назревшее решение незамедлительно признать независимость и суверенитет Донецкой Народной Республики и Луганской Народной Республики. Прошу Федеральное собрание Российской Федерации поддержать это решение, а затем и ратифицировать договоры о дружбе и взаимопомощи с обеими республиками. Два эти документа будут подготовлены и подписаны в самое ближайшее время. А от тех, кто захватил и удерживает власть в Киеве, мы требуем незамедлительно прекратить боевые действия. В противном случае вся ответственность за возможное продолжение кровопролития будет целиком и полностью на совести правящего на территории Украины режима.
Russia immediately took action to neutralize Ukrainian military positions and provide safe corridors for refugees to escape the country. The areas in red on this map represent Russian-controlled territory. Note that Russia already had annexed Crimea in the south. The two newly recognized republics are located in the far east. And Russia also captured the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the upper north.
And as sirens blare above, exhausted families filled metro stations that double as bomb shelters. They fled their homes with only what they could carry, including furry friends and the prized possessions that help a people under siege maintain their spirits. Thousands are trying to flee. Families who make it to Romania's border have to split up. Ukraine blocked 18 to 60-year-old men from leaving. A senior U.S. official says Russian troops in the south are advancing past Kherson and splitting off and heading toward Mariupol. In Kakhovka, Russian forces are battling for a dam and power plant. On the Sea of Azov, thousands of Russian troops are coming ashore, and Russia continues its assaults toward Kyiv and, in the east, on Kharkiv.
Immediately, refugees started flowing into not only the neighboring countries of Ukraine, but to Israel too. Note the wording of this article dated March 10th, 3 weeks into the Exodus. Israel seeks to contain flood of Ukrainian refugees. Flood of refugees. That's it. It's a flood, but not of water, a flood of people. And it all started on February 21st of 2022 when Jupiter entered the flood of water. Amazing. Just like all the other instances over the past 5 years, Jupiter was spot on with the flood of refugees. The signs in heaven are still accurately expressing the events here on earth. The flood started with Putin's declaration on February the 21st of 2022. And a look back at John's prophecy shows that he actually said that the serpent spewed water like a flood after Israel. It's not inappropriate to use the word water as a metaphor to describe a large group of people. Just 2 verses later, in Revelation chapter 13, John again uses water to denote the masses of humanity. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. This beast is not actually rising up out of the ocean. It's rising up out of the sea of people. The 7 heads are nations of people. On March 6, 2022, Israeli Interior Minister Ayet Shaked said that it was impossible for Israel to keep absorbing Ukrainian refugees at the current rate. Of the 2,034 Ukrainians who have arrived since the start of the war, only 10% are eligible for Israeli citizenship under the law of return. She predicts that if the current pace continues, there will be 15,000 refugees within the month. She said, it's impossible to continue with a rate of entry like this. We need to delineate a policy. Relative to its size, Israel has brought in more Ukrainians than any state in Europe besides those bordering Ukraine.
Insensitive or inevitable, while Israel is spearheading humanitarian aid in Ukraine and also diplomatic efforts to bring about an end to the crisis, criticism over its policy of receiving refugees is mounting.
The implications of the war are reaching everywhere, to us as well. We in the State of Israel have absorbed, as of now, hundreds of refugees, some of them Jews, most of them not. Naturally, the State of Israel will focus on Jewish refugees.
Currently, in Russia, there are 600,000 people eligible to come to Israel under the law of return, which allows those with Jewish roots to immigrate to Israel. In Ukraine, there are about 200,000. But the main debate centers around those who are fleeing the war and do not have any Jewish connection. A special ministerial immigration and integration committee convened Monday in a bid to improve the current framework, but Interior Minister Ayelet Shaked says what many think but few voice. Israel will help, but it's Europe that should take the mass burden.
Yesterday, I took a tour of Ben Gurion Airport. There are Israeli staffers who speak Russian and Ukrainian, and they work very hard. It is true that one should wait, but one should also be patient. The attitude of the people of the Population Authority is good. Today, about 20% of those who arrived are eligible for immigration. We have a challenge as a small country to absorb large numbers. We have to tell the truth. Europe is open to these citizens, and they can work there.
However, 2 days later, she appears to have a change of heart. On March 8th of 2022, Ayelet Shaked laid out a new, more compassionate plan for the Ukrainian refugees. Ukrainian citizens who arrive in Israel will receive a temporary visa for a period of 3 months. If the fighting does not stop, Ukrainian citizens will later also be allowed to work in Israel. And this is valid for Ukrainian citizens already in Israel and those who will arrive later. In total, Israel will temporarily host about 25,000 Ukrainian citizens until the conflict ends. Israel is preparing to receive about 100,000 civilians from Ukraine, Russia, and the Commonwealth of the Independent States who are fleeing the fighting in the region according to the law of return, and that means they're legitimately recognized as Jewish citizens. Israel is expected to be one of the leading countries in the world in absorbing Ukrainians fleeing the battles, certainly compared to its size. Now, this is the main point right here. Due to the large numbers of Jewish Ukrainians, 200,000 are eligible to migrate to Israel. Israel would have been forced to take in a disproportionate number of refugees. They have no alternative. They have to receive the Jewish refugees. No other country is expected to deal with an event of this magnitude. It's equivalent to granting citizenship to 3.5 million people in the United States. The large number of Jewish residents in Ukraine were being used to overwhelm the small nation of Israel. John saw this as a deliberate act of the devil. That's why he wrote that he, the devil, might cause her to be carried away by the flood. This whole refugee crisis was focused on destroying Israel. That's the main motive. Sure, there are other plots and overlapping schemes interwoven between the nations of NATO, Ukraine, and Russia, but as far as John was concerned, this flood of immigrants was only to destroy Israel. This article from Forbes makes you wonder if this whole refugee crisis wasn't deliberately planned anyway, just like John declared it was. A Russian invasion of Ukraine could flood Europe with millions of refugees. It's written a whole month earlier, on January the 20th of 2022. Why were they even pontificating about a Russian invasion unless that was their plan all along? And notice that there's that word, flood, again. Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, who will share the prime minister position with Naftali Bennett, he stated, "We're going to take care of these refugees the way we would like our grandmother and our kids to be taken care of." Any Ukrainian refugee who has family in Israel will be allowed entry without limit. That means that Israel might have to receive up to 200,000 Jewish Ukrainians. Israel had no choice but to do what was morally correct and welcome the flood of new Jewish residents. But they called on the other nations to do their part and let Israel focus only on Jewish refugees, not the non-Jewish ones.
Now, the Ukraine conflict has also spurred an internal political debate within Israel over how many non-Jewish refugees the country should be willing to take in. Interior Minister Ayelet Shaked, whose authority extends over border controls, has taken what some call a minimalist position, only now conceding that the country will allow some 20,000 Ukrainians who were already residing in the country before the invasion to remain, while also granting permits to a further 5,000 non-Jewish refugees escaping the war. Now, that stance spurred a demonstration last night outside Shaked's home, with dozens calling for Israel to allow in more refugees. Ukraine's embassy in Israel is now supporting a petition to the High Court of Justice against Israel's entry limits for Ukrainian refugees. The court will hear the suit this week, which argues that Shaked is violating bilateral agreements between Ukraine and Israel without proper authority, and her moves also violate international conventions on refugees. Well, this evening, Shaked agreed to exempt Ukrainians with relatives in Israel from the entry cap, but defended her overall policy, speaking a short time ago at Ben Gurion Airport.
Israel is the national home of the Jewish people. I suggest to all of those who criticize Israel, go to Terminal 1, see how hundreds of new immigrants come here every day. 450 are arriving here today from Ukraine who are escaping the fights. And we receive them. We turn them into citizens. No other country is dealing with this scale of immediate absorption. And despite the fact that they attack me and criticize me, I do not forget that first and foremost we are the homeland of the Jewish people, and we will invest most of our efforts in those entitled to move here.
2 million. That's currently how many people have fled Ukraine since Russia invaded less than 2 weeks ago. And in what has been called a, quote, dark historical first by the United Nations, more than 1 million of them are Ukrainian youth.
We don't have an exact breakdown of the numbers by gender and by age, but of course we know that the majority are women and children who have come across.
The demographics also reflect the current obligation, forbidding Ukrainian men from age 18 to 60 to leave the country. More than half of refugees have fled to neighboring Poland, with many also heading to Hungary, Slovakia, Moldova, and Romania.
As this map shows, the other nations did do their part in taking in the fleeing refugees. Poland has done the most, accepting well over 1 million people. Slovakia took in 141,000. Hungary, 191,000. Romania, 82,000. Moldova, 83,000. And not to be forgotten, but not on this map, Russia, 185,000. Everything went exactly as the Apostle John saw in his vision. He said, "But the earth helped the woman," or Israel, "and swallowed up the flood." Notice that it doesn't say that the earth swallowed up water. The earth swallowed up the flood of people. The surrounding nations helped swallow up the flood of refugees. They could have refused to accept anyone, but they didn't. They undoubtedly took in a lot of Jewish refugees too. This helped ease the burden on Israel, because Israel didn't have to take in all of the Jewish refugees, even though they were morally obligated to do so. With the other nations not discriminating and rejecting Jewish immigrants, they helped ease the burden on Israel, just as John said would happen. Here's an article, How Europe is Responding to a Flood of Ukrainian Refugees. Look at how the word flood is used over and over again. John saw it as a flood, and so does everyone else. And another article about the flood. Ukraine refugees flood Warsaw, overwhelming the Polish city.
That's how desperately this capital city is trying to absorb a sudden spike in population, 20% in a few short weeks. There's an outpouring of support for Ukraine, but volunteers are stretched thin, and Warsaw is heaving from the strain. At the country's largest stadium, a crush of refugees wait anxiously. A full day outside, only to get a wristband to wait again inside for Polish identity papers, to work, access healthcare, and go to school in their temporary landing spot. It's so hard, Tatiana says, wrangling restless children and standing in line.
This Wall Street Journal article calls the crisis a flood too. These Ukrainian refugees have just arrived at a Paris train station from Germany in mid-March. Flood of refugees from Ukraine war tests Europe's capacity to welcome them. More than 3.5 million people have fled the Russian invasion, raising pressure for a continent-wide humanitarian response. And this is as of March the 22nd of 2022. Jupiter leaves the Aquarius constellation at the end of March of 2022 and begins to enter the constellation of Pisces, the fishes. Let's take a look at Jupiter's position on a very special day, September the 26th of 2022. This is no ordinary day. It is the appointed time of trumpets, known as Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets. It is on this day that Jupiter makes its closest approach to Earth for the year of 2022. However, this time is also the closest approach to Earth in the last 59 years. So we have a sign happening on an appointed time. Anytime you see a special event such as this, take notice. In Genesis 1:14, God says, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years." So the main two reasons for creating the stars and the planets are for signs and seasons. The Hebrew word translated as seasons actually means appointed times. When you see the first two main reasons happening at the same time, take notice. We have the sign of Jupiter's closest approach to Earth happening on the appointed time of the Feast of Trumpets, September 26th of 2022. This is a significant day. Now let's read the final verse of Revelation chapter 12. "And the dragon was enraged with the woman, Israel, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God, the Jews, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ, the Christians." That's it. That's the final verse, and that is where we are today. There is nothing left but fighting a war with the devil. It's that late in the game. This is not to be taken lightly. This is the time when champions are made. This is the time to be counted worthy to escape and stand before the Son of Man. Yeshua gave this warning. "Watch, therefore, and pray always, that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man." So there are two necessary things, watching and praying always. If you do these two things, you'll be all right. What do you watch for? You have to watch for something. You watch for the appointed time. That's what. Here's the verse that proves it. "Blessed are the people who know the joyful sound," or teruah. "They walk, Yehovah, in the light of your countenance." The words, "the joyful sound," are not correctly translated. These all three stand for just one Hebrew word, teruah. Yes, teruah as in Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets. Let's read it again without the extra words. "Blessed are the people who know teruah. They walk, O Yehovah, in the light of your countenance." Did you get it? Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, is the time of the catching up. It's the time of the rapture. This Old Testament verse is saying that if you know about the catching up on the Feast of Trumpets, then you'll be walking in the light of Jehovah's countenance. You will be counted worthy to escape and stand before the Son of Man. This is the feast to watch for. Trumpets is when the catching up happens. It may not happen on this particular year, but what better time to be prepared than when you have a sign of a close approach of Jupiter on the same day? And guess what? There's more. There's another sign that happens on this same day. It's the sign of the Son of Man. That's what we're looking at right now. Jupiter in Pisces fits the description of the sign of the Son of Man. First, Jupiter is representative of the Messiah. And second, Pisces, the fishes, is representative of the fisher of men, Yeshua. Think about it. We've watched Jupiter over a 5-year period, going from constellation to constellation, everything matching up perfectly with the book of Revelation chapter 12. And now that we're finished with this chapter, wouldn't this be the perfect time just to keep following Jupiter and see the next sign? The sign of the Son of Man is only mentioned one time, and it's assumed that the reader should know what it is. It has to be a common, well-known sign like Pisces. And since we have just seen Jupiter fulfill the prophecy to the most minute detail in 6 consecutive constellations, wouldn't you think it shouldn't end until we at least have a 7th constellation? Using the godly number of 7, now is the perfect time to expect to see a perfect 7th sign in the 7th consecutive constellation. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. This matches up perfectly where we left off in the last verse of Revelation chapter 12. The devil was at war with the Jews and the Christians, remember? If this is indeed the sign of the Son of Man, then it's telling us to expect to see mourning now. This is the same thing as being persecuted by the devil. They overlap. This verse from Matthew meshes up perfectly with the last verse from Revelation chapter 12. And it's with Jupiter and the next sequential constellation, like it was planned that way. And then, after unspecified period of mourning, figure it being about the 7-year period, then they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. That's the second coming. That's when Yeshua returns with his saints. My prayer is that you be counted worthy to be one of those privileged to return with him. Thanks for watching.